In our last video, we talked about context. In this one, we're going to talk about compassion, or making yourself more accessible to learners. You're a pretty key component of this course, so of course, we need to pay attention to how you can make yourself more accessible to the learners as well. There are a couple of simple strategies that you can use to do this. One is just being more mindful of the language that you use in class, so it's not just what you say, but how you're saying it to others. And a simple reframing of your wording can be pretty powerful for a lot of people out there. For example, person-first language is a very popular trend when it comes to accessible and inclusive course design. So if we were to focus on users who come to our courses and they happen to be living with learning impairments or emotional disorders or mental disorders, typically the language has been disorder first. So a disabled person, a blind person, a deaf person, etc. What I want to encourage you to do is to flip that around, because defining someone through their disability is not especially fair to them. They are still their own person, they are still living their own lives, and they don't necessarily want to be defined through the lens of their disability, even though their disability or impairment has a pretty big impact on their day-to-day life. So what I would encourage you to do is switch to person-first language. So this is just a really simple switch. It's just a person living with a disability, a person who happens to be blind, a person who is deaf, a person with autism. This seems like a simple switch, but putting the person first instead of the impairment or the disability can have a really big impact on how they think you think about them within the context of the course. Now, in one of the earlier videos, I pointed out that it's really easy to overlook people outside our zone of normal, but it's also very easy to overlook people inside our zone of normal. And what I mean by that is some disorders are virtually impossible to spot if you don't live with them, because some folks who live with those conditions have done a really good job of learning a technique called masking. And masking is really just when a neurodivergent person, such as someone who has autism or someone who has ADHD, has learned how to comfort the neurotypical people around them who don't live with those disorders. In other words, they have learned how to mimic behavior of neurotypical folks so that their impairment is fundamentally invisible. So providing space and support for these impairments within your learning environment can have a pretty big impact, because it takes a tremendous amount of energy to spend the entire day pretending that you are someone that you actually are not. And a lot of our learners do this because they are afraid of being judged, or because they have had such bad experiences being their true authentic selves in front of other people who do not live with the same conditions that they do. So ultimately what we're talking about here when we're talking about compassion is providing multiple pathways to the same destination. If COVID has proven anything over the past year and a half, going on 2 years, it's that we can successfully work remotely, even if it's not necessarily the preference of our employer or of the instructor in a course. Think about the things that you've learned to do over the past year, the way that you have learned how to maybe broadcast a course to learners who are fully remote. Now think about the fact that one of your learners who has an invisible impairment might just be struggling that day. It could be someone who lives with a mobile impairment and transportation's just not working out that day. It could be someone who's living with a significant financial burden and they literally can't afford to put gas in their car to come to campus. It could just be someone who's feeling really overwhelmed by gesturing broadly at everything going on in the world. They're just feeling overwhelmed, but they still want to meet and engage with the class. Someone who's living with anxiety, as an example. They can still participate if we're providing multiple pathways for them to do so. In fact, creating more pathways ends up helping everyone. So we're talking about making yourself more accessible through your language, but also using the tools that are available and allowing your students to engage on multiple levels depending on what their abilities are. In the next video, we'll talk a little bit about clarity, which is our next concept.